Thanks, guys, and thanks again for having me this weekend. It's been a real treat to be here. I was thinking it's so easy just to be in the dugout of your own church and just really focused on everything that's going on there. And sometimes it's great to just step back and see something different and see what the Lord is doing somewhere else in this great partnership in the gospel that we're all involved in together. So thank you for the blessing of being with you. I don't know if any of you are into Lord of the Rings. Any Lord of the Rings people here? Okay, I'm not. Sorry, that's not where this is going. Um, sorry, it goes back to a guy at school called Mark, who I used to see him walking around with the thickest book that I've ever seen in my life. I think it would have been The Hobbit. Probably, and I made a mental note at the time to keep away from that stuff because I like my entertainment to be concise, and The Lord of the Rings, as you know, is never concise. Anyway, my brother took me to see The Return of the King at the cinema, and I managed to stay awake mainly, follow the plot mainly. And at the end of the final battle scene, I got quite excited. I thought it's been a bit of an endurance test, but we've made it. Start gathering up the popcorn. But that battle scene was not the end. And the next scene was not the end either, and nor was the one after that. And it was a terrible tease because if you've seen it, all of those scenes had the fade out and the big music, and the thing just goes on and on and on. The Return of the King is the movie that keeps on giving because it never ends. Well, the point of that is you may feel the end of Esther is a bit like that. We've already had the big baddie hanging. Time for the credits to roll. Why so much time devoted to tying up the loose ends? Esther finishes with this bunch of letters and administration. Well, it's the main practical application for the people of God. So even though it's admin, please don't zone out. Remember. That's the thing here. How good's your memory, I wonder? How good's your memory for the things that God has done for you? It is the secret to the Christian life, you know. Remember. First, the great reversal is fully accomplished. I think we're wired to love it when the tables are turned, you know, defeat looms, the opposition look invincible, and somehow the great reversal is accomplished. It just seems to be a plot line written into the fabric of the universe, which is not surprising because it's a plot line written into the workings of the God who runs the universe. 8 verse 2, wasn't that happy ending time? But Haman's law to have all the Jews annihilated on a certain date is still the law. So Esther begs the king that it's revoked, and as ever, he's amenable but slightly confused. 8 verse 7, King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I've given his estate to Esther, and they've impaled him on the pole he set up. Now, write another decree in the king's name on behalf of all the Jews, as seems best to you. In other words, Esther, Mordecai, you sort it out and I'll sign on the dotted line, says the king. They can't revoke Haman's order, law of the Medes and the Persians, but they can come up with an edict of their own. Mordecai's new edict mainly involves using two computer keys, Control-C and Control-V. Is that cut and paste? You know, when I was a young lawyer, most of the job involved using those two computer keys because all you did was cut and paste documents that are already written and write in the new person's details. There might be slightly more to it than that since I've left the profession. But chapter 8, it's mainly a cut and paste of Haman's edict from chapter 3, and it's really interesting. You could later on hold chapter 3 right next to chapter 8 and just see the repeated language. Royal secretary summoned chapter 3, royal secretary summoned chapter 8. Haman ordered back in chapter 3. Now Mordecai orders chapter 8. All the provinces. And 8 verse 11 is the key similarity and difference. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month. Same day. So the day's coming when Haman's evil edict will kick in. His armed forces will be ruthless, women and children targeted, and the Jews now given the right to defend themselves on that dreaded day. Notice the reaction in 8 verse 15 at the passing of the edicts. 8 verse 15. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. Woo! There's a scene in the movie Lincoln where the vote is passed, the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution, and that abolished slavery. And the scene is just this sheer joy. The senators all whooping, raising their hats in the air, throwing each other around the building. All that happened was a law was passed. No one's life changed at that exact moment, but the edict changed everything. And it's the same here, verse 16. The Jews who'd done 4 things, mourned, fasted, wept, and wailed. 4 things again in 8:16. Happiness, joy, gladness, honor. And striking that in the provinces, instead of Jews laying low like Mordecai and Esther did at the start of the book, other people are becoming them. End of chapter 8. Whether it's a genuine conversion or they just see which way the wind was blowing, you want to be on the same side as the Jews now. David arrives, 9 verse 1. Some dates go down in infamy, don't they? So September 11, 2001. You know what I'm on about. All I've said is a date. Well, the 13th day of the 12th month should be a day of infamy for the Jews. But end of 9 verse 1, the great reversal. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who had hated them, including the 10 sons of Haman. And verse 16, they killed 75,000 of them, but didn't lay their hands on the plunder. Now, I wondered what you made of that when we got to that bit in the reading. Esther is this light-hearted book in many ways. The booing, the laughing are deemed to be the appropriate tone. We may be shocked at that ending, all this killing. The edict and the detail make it clear they're only acting in self-defense, only against armies who were attacking them. And that detail in verse 15 and 16, not taking the plunder, says this was a holy war in that sense. Their only motive was to protect themselves. And there was an opportunity to join the Jews. I guess also the sheer number of deaths reminds us how great the threat was across this vast empire. 127 provinces, largest percentage of the world population ever under one government. Murderers are out to attack the Jews in all those places. Haman and his sons were not Boy Scouts. They were genocidal. And stringing up those ringleaders was a very public way of saying evil lost here today. 9 verse 17 is VE Day. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Again, how are we getting to know God better here? I think we can say from Esther that the hidden hand of the Lord has quite a particular artistic style. So the old preacher Charles Spurgeon said, it's like looking at a picture, and even though the artist's name isn't written at the bottom, the brushstrokes are so familiar that you know just who crafted this piece. Or think of a movie director who's got a particular style, even if he's not mentioned, you know that he's the one sovereign over this script. So what do I mean by that? Well, spot the God specials, if you like, enemies he allows to do their worst, seemingly invincible, the humbling of the proud, the raising up of a representative from nowhere, a nobody, to plead for others before the Almighty, a decree of death trumped by a decree of life, rescue and judgment happening alongside each other. This is before you even get to Jesus. These are the brushstrokes of Yahweh of old. A torture device that becomes an instrument of salvation. Is that me reading too much in? Well, you're allowed to think that, but not if you think it because you don't think God could have been in control of those details. A delay before final rescue, and people turning in that delay. We live in a time like that. Delivered, but waiting for final deliverance. And our leader ruling at the end who is loved because he always seeks peace and his people's good. Remind you of anyone? This is a Yahweh special. It's his signature style. It's just the way you would expect the covenant God of the Bible to work. And the point of noticing those familiar brushstrokes is not so you win the quiz for most number of references to Jesus in the gospel that you can spot in Esther. It's to help you when life feels a bit exilish, when everything against God looks strong, when others seem to decree the script. We won't be too fazed. We'll remember that turning the tables, that's his speciality. We'll remember that he does some of his best work in the darkness and the weakness. Have you found that in your own life yet? When there's delay before final rescue, and when all you feel like doing is lamenting and weeping, this pattern reminds us that for God and his people, the story arc always ends in gladness. So I really hope and pray that hearing something a bit like our big rescue will leave us thanking the Lord for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever, even in the seasons when he looks invisible. We have blessings to remember and to count. Aren't we part of the most amazing turning of the tables that there's ever been? You were under a decree of death. You had a seemingly invincible enemy in Satan and his forces of sin that were a shadow over your whole life and destiny. But a leader was raised up for you to turn it all around. Oh, I get so used to salvation, but Kev, hell loomed for you deservedly, and now totally undeservedly. Heaven beckons to welcome you and me to a feast of celebration. It's some story, isn't it? Your story, our story. I don't know if it is your story yet. It could be your story. Join the community of the rescued if you haven't yet come to Jesus and know this joy. Which brings us to the main practical take home for the ordinary people of God. And that's that exiles should always be rememberers. 9 verse 18 is about admin and diaries, but it's fun admin to do with setting up this feast of celebration. Mordecai sends letters about it. The Jews say they'll do this Purim thing every year. The point, verse 28, being that these days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, in every province, in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews. It's Remembrance Day, kind of, but it's more VE Day. It's street party time, Purim. And sure enough, that's how lots of Jewish people continue to remember it today. Special foods, family gatherings, they read Esther. And I take it that's why this history book, it's a history book, Esther, but it's crafted in a way that makes it fun and memorable, because it being memorable is the point. The story isn't over until provision is made for the great rescue story to be remembered. Which is yet another sign that the covenant Lord is behind this. Because when he acts big to rescue, he says, you got to remember it. Exodus. It always strikes me there's more word count in Exodus on how they're to remember the Passover than there is word count on what actually happens that night. Suggestion is they're going to be forgetters rather than rememberers. And I'm afraid that history and our story has often borne that out. God's people are better forgetters than rememberers. Because middle of the story syndrome weighs us down. The thing that will keep us going, remembering the Lord. If only we can nail remembering, I think that makes us onto the thing that is the thing that will keep us going in the Christian life. Because in the Bible, remembering is directly linked to not fearing, not bowing to other gods, not boasting, because we're the community of the rescued. It's nothing to do with anything we've done. Remembering is directly linked to not grumbling, and remembering is what makes you say things like, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Remember what precisely? 9 verse 22, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, as the month when sorrow was turned to joy and mourning into a day of celebration. In other words, remember, deliverance always arises with the Lord. And there's no obligation for us to celebrate Purim, as there's no obligation for Christians to celebrate the Exodus rescue, not because those things aren't part of our heritage, but because they're actually just shadows of the bigger rescue that we are told to remember. Jesus, as he prepares for the cross, the place of relief and deliverance, says, well, he shares bread and says, do this in remembrance of me. So I think the book ends this way because the big crisis moments are not something we can engineer, but we can cultivate a way of life that says we have a better story, and we are to cultivate rhythms of remembering. And actually, if you think about it, it was a community celebration for them. Gathering to be rememberers is in huge part what church life is all about, isn't it? As we sing and pray and read the Bible and encourage each other on. You're clearly committed to all of that because you're here. But I find I can just be quite blasé about church life. It's just another Sunday, just another small group. No, it's not just another anything. We're in a battle with the world and the flesh and the devil. And I think it's just easy sometimes to put all our main focus into work, studies, family life, and church will just kind of always be there. But the default in exile is to drift into forgetting. And that's why I want to really fight to cultivate and nurture friendships and habits that really matter because they help me to remember the Lord. I wonder if being organized is underrated as a spiritual thing. Decide to be and stay organized in your week. As you make life decisions and things change, how are we going to cultivate rhythms of remembering in this new phase? It really matters. Because do you know people whose memory of the gospel has faded? It can happen really gradually, sadly. And do you know people who've kept trusting him through deep pains in a broken world? Yeah, you do, because it's some of you. Again, it's been a privilege just to hear a little bit about some of your stories. And I think of people like you at Euston Church. One of the greatest ways I've grown as a Christian personally in the last 16 years is being around some people who, in the pit and through the tears, have still said, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. It's amazing. I'm tempted to think of folk like that as heroes. They're not actually heroes. What they are is wonderful examples of what it means and the difference it makes on the dark days when you've remembered the Lord on the ordinary days. The difference on the dark days when you've cultivated remembering him on the ordinary days. Purim is a picture for us of a better day, a better celebration, a feast for the people of God. It's a picture of a leader who only ever leads for his people's good. We still live in the middle of our deliverance story, but the end script has been written, and you can be sure it will be another Yahweh special. Relief from enemies, mourning into a celebration, days of feasting and joy. Come, Lord Jesus, eh? Come really soon, please, Lord Jesus. Amen.